Why was Tracy Reiner burning her father's belongings just hours after his murder? The question wasn't whispered. It was screamed through the lens of a security camera. It was 3:14 a.m. when Jake Reiner, son of Hollywood legend Rob Reiner, replayed the footage for the fifth time. No matter how many times he watched it, the image never made sense. His half-sister, Tracy Reiner, cloaked in shadows, crouched near the grand marble fireplace of their father's Brentwood estate. Dragging boxes, stuffing papers, tossing framed photos into a growing fire like she was purging a lifetime. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. She wasn't crying. She wasn't grieving. She was destroying. And the flames? They weren't just firewood and ash. They were secrets, burning fast, burning hot. But why? Why would a daughter do that the very night her parents were found brutally murdered? And why did Jake, a veteran journalist known for cutting through political spin, now find himself plunged into the most gut-wrenching investigation of his life? One that involved his own family. Because he saw something in that footage that wasn't just suspicious, it was unforgivable. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. A family no stranger to the spotlight. To the world, Rob Reiner was the affable face of Hollywood. From All in the Family to When Harry Met Sally, he shaped American storytelling for decades. But behind the camera, within the guarded walls of his Brentwood home, a very different story was unfolding. One filled with tension, resentment, and the kind of secrets that don't stay buried. Rob, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, weren't just parents. They were powerhouses, philanthropists, icons, leaders of a family that had grown into something complex, maybe even dangerous. Their children, especially Jake and Romy, were close, protective, private. Then there was Nick. Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old screenwriter son who had long battled addiction, relapse, and suspicion. He lived in the guest house behind the estate, far enough to be invisible, close enough to hear a scream. Police would later say he was arrested that same night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But from the very beginning, something didn't sit right with Jake. Something gnawed at him, clawing its way into his mind. Nick wasn't the only one acting strange that night. The call that shattered everything. The first alert didn't come from the police. It came from his sister Romy. She was sobbing, breathless. "They're gone," she choked. "Mom and Dad, they're gone. And someone else is here. Someone dangerous. You need to come now." Jake didn't ask questions. He just drove. He would later describe that ride as the longest 18 minutes of his life. His thoughts were a maze of panic and confusion. But what hit hardest was the voice at the end of the call, Romy's voice. She didn't sound afraid of an intruder. She sounded afraid of someone she knew. When Jake pulled into the estate's long, tree-shrouded driveway, the mansion was lit up like a Hollywood set. Police cars, ambulances, yellow tape fluttering in the cold breeze like warning flags at sea. But inside, something even colder was waiting. The scene nobody wanted to see. Rob and Michelle Reiner were found in their bedroom, stabbed. No signs of forced entry, no robbery, no struggle, at least not one that spilled outside the room. The police suspected Nick almost immediately. He had a key to the main house. He had a record, and he had motive, or so they thought. But what bothered Jake wasn't the murder. It was the absence of grief. He scanned the room, Romy in a corner, pale and shaking. Officers murmuring in tight knots. But then he spotted Tracy, calm, still. Her arms folded, her face expressionless. She didn't rush to Romy, didn't ask about the investigation. Instead, she was asking something else. "Do you have the keys to the study?" she whispered to one officer, too quietly, thinking no one would hear. But Jake did, and that's when his alarm bells started ringing. Tracy Reiner, the forgotten storm. Tracy was Rob's daughter from another life, born to Penny Marshall, adopted by Rob, always on the periphery of Hollywood's golden glow. She had her own career, her own demons, her own way of handling pain. But in that moment, Jake saw something he couldn't unsee. Control. It wasn't sadness that cloaked her. It was control, a hunger to manage something, erase something, before anyone else noticed. What did she need to get from the study? Why was she asking for access that night, when her parents' bodies were barely cold? Jake didn't know yet, but he would find out. And when he did, it would lead him to that fireplace, to that burning pile of history, and to the ugliest truth the Reiner family had ever tried to bury. Smoke and silence. The first official statement from LAPD came the next morning. It was vague, distant, clinical. Authorities are investigating the deaths of 2 residents at a Brentwood property. A male individual has been arrested in connection. That male individual was Nick Reiner. But the press had already exploded. Reiner family tragedy. Hollywood legend slain. Troubled son at center of probe. What no one outside the house knew, what even the detectives hadn't yet discovered, was that inside that same house, someone else was already cleaning up. Jake had left that night at 4:03 a.m. after giving a full statement to officers. He returned the next evening, after finally getting access to the home again. But something smelled wrong. Literally. It was faint, but distinct, the scent of charred paper. Ash. The fireplace had been recently used, in a house where it hadn't been lit in months. Curious, Jake checked the living room camera logs. Rob, ever the privacy-conscious patriarch, had installed a private cloud system for home security. Jake knew the passcode. He clicked open the midnight file, and there she was. Flames don't lie. Tracy, hair pulled back, dressed in black, moving fast but deliberate, carrying a heavy duffel. She opened the fireplace doors, fumbled with matches, then dumped everything into the flames. A flicker of firelight caught the edge of something shiny, possibly a photo frame. Then a folder. Then a script. Jake froze the frame. It was his father's handwriting. She wasn't mourning. She was erasing. She wasn't mourning. She was erasing. Why would someone destroy the memories of the people they claimed to love? That question would consume Jake Reiner, and it would haunt him for weeks to come. But in that moment, staring at a paused surveillance still of his half-sister feeding a fire with his father's most personal belongings, he wasn't thinking like a son. He was thinking like a journalist. And every instinct he'd ever sharpened in a newsroom screamed the same word: cover up. The fireplace had always been symbolic in the Reiner household. A place of warmth, of gathering, of safety. Now, it was a crime scene within a crime scene. But what was she burning? Jake squinted at the footage, scrubbing the video back a few seconds. He zoomed in. The camera resolution wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to spot certain items. One was a folder, a leather-bound portfolio, the kind Rob used for early film treatments. Another was unmistakable, a framed photo of Rob and Jake on the set of A Few Good Men. Jake remembered it. He gave it to Rob for his 70th birthday, and now it was in flames. Why? What did that photo represent to Tracy? What did Jake represent? What, if anything, was she trying to erase? 2 families, 1 house, too many secrets. Let's take a step back. Rob Reiner's family wasn't like most. It wasn't even like most Hollywood families, which says a lot. He had children from different relationships, career trajectories that overlapped, deep divides that were papered over in public. Tracy Reiner was Penny Marshall's daughter. When Penny and Rob were married, he adopted Tracy and raised her as his own. But they divorced when Tracy was just 7. That early fracture shaped her. According to friends, Tracy always felt like she lived in 2 worlds and never fully belonged in either. While Rob went on to become a Hollywood titan, Tracy's own career stalled. She had small roles. She directed indie projects. But there was always a sense, subtle, whispered, that she'd been overshadowed. By Jake. By Romy. Even by Nick, despite his troubles. That resentment? It didn't go away. It just simmered. So when Jake saw her burning family photos, it wasn't just about grief. It was about ownership. She wasn't erasing Rob's legacy. She was rewriting it. The fire was warm. She wasn't. Jake wasn't the only one who noticed the fire. One of the cleaning staff, Maria Alvarez, who had worked for the Reiners for over a decade, spoke quietly to detectives 2 days later. I saw the fire, she said. I thought it was strange. Why? Because the heater was already on. The house was warm. She was sweating, but she kept adding more paper. I thought maybe it was personal. Grieving. And did she say anything? Yes. She kept muttering one word. Mistake, mistake, mistake. Maria didn't understand. But Jake did. Something had gone wrong. And Tracy was trying to fix it. In the most destructive way possible. Romy's silence breaks everything. For 24 hours after the murders, Romy barely spoke. She was in shock. Numb. But then something shifted. Jake and Romy sat outside the estate, beneath the orange glow of a security lamp. Neither of them had slept. And Romy, voice low and trembling, asked a question that cut like glass. Jake, do you think she did it? He didn't respond right away. Because, Romy continued, I heard them fighting. Dad and Tracy. The night before. Jake turned toward her slowly. What were they fighting about? Romy hesitated. She said he lied to her. That she wasn't in the will. That she wasn't family. Jake blinked. But she is family. Romy looked at him, eyes wet. Is she? The missing page. Later that night, Jake returned to the living room. He stood in front of the fireplace like it was a grave site. Ash coated the stone floor. Tiny, blackened fragments of paper floated in the air, still dancing from the last embers. Then he saw it. A half-burnt sheet of paper wedged between the grate and the hearth. He pulled it out carefully, coughing through the rising dust. What was left was barely readable. Most of the ink had smudged or turned to smoke. But one sentence remained. Regret that I never told Romy or Jake the full truth about Tracy. If anything happens to me, she... And the rest was gone. Burnt to nothing. Jake sat down on the floor, the paper trembling in his hand. What truth? What didn't they know? And was Rob trying to warn them? Danger in the shadows. Jake didn't tell the police what he'd found. Not yet. He wasn't ready. Why? Because if Tracy really had something to hide, if she really believed Rob had betrayed her, then she wasn't just grieving. She was unraveling. And if she'd already burned part of the truth, what was she planning next? Jake began reviewing every hour of the security footage. Every angle. Every entry and exit log. He looked for inconsistencies. For patterns. For moments when Tracy moved through the house with purpose. And at 2:38 a.m., 30 minutes before the fire started, he saw something he never expected. Tracy had entered Rob's private study, carrying gloves. Jake makes a decision. He couldn't wait anymore. Jake called Romy. We need to find out what else she touched, he said. Before it's gone. They waited until dawn, when the house was quiet, when Tracy had finally left to meet with their lawyers. Then they entered the study. What they found was eerie. Files missing. The safe partially open. Rob's handwritten notes gone. But one drawer was jammed shut. Romy pulled. Jake tugged. It finally gave. Inside, a flash drive. A folder labeled Private, TR. And a photograph Jake had never seen before. It was Rob and Tracy years ago. Younger. Smiling. But on the back, in Rob's unmistakable script, were the words. Forgive, but never forget. Jake looked at Romy. Do you know what this means? Romy shook her head. Jake pocketed the drive. He was done watching from the sidelines. It was time to dig. Deep. And what he'd uncover next would flip the entire investigation upside down. Because there were more secrets in this family. And the next one was already whispering through the walls. What does horror sound like when it's your own family screaming it? For Romy Reiner, it was a broken silence. A soft creak in the floorboards. A muffled cry in the early morning. And then, a door slamming shut, never to open again. December 14th, 3:47 a.m. Brentwood, Los Angeles. A $13.5 million mansion. Once a sanctuary, now a scene of unimaginable violence. By sunrise, news helicopters swarmed the skies. Tabloid vans lined the edge of the gated driveway. Photographers with lenses the size of rocket launchers clicked into the misty dawn, desperate to catch a glimpse of a tragedy they would never fully understand. Because this wasn't just a Hollywood scandal. This was a Shakespearean implosion. A modern-day Greek tragedy with blood on the floor and a legacy in ruins. Rob Reiner. Dead. Michelle Reiner. Dead. Nick Reiner. Arrested. And in the background, unseen, unspoken, Tracy Reiner was already lighting the match. But let's back up. Because what happened inside that house didn't start with murder. It started with silence. With subtle shifts in behavior. With the kind of darkness that tiptoes around your ankles until one day, it swallows the whole room. A call that wasn't supposed to happen. 911 dispatcher. What is your emergency? Romy Reiner. They're not answering. I think. Something's wrong. Something happened. Romy had spent the night editing reels in her guest bedroom when she realized something wasn't right. The house was too quiet. For a place usually filled with noise, Rob's humming in the kitchen, Michelle's voice drifting from the piano room. It was unsettling. And then she noticed the front light was still on. That only happened if someone was still awake. She crept down the hallway barefoot, her heart pounding in rhythms she couldn't control. "Mom?" she whispered. "Dad?" Nothing. She tried calling Rob's phone. No answer. She tried Michelle's. Straight to voicemail. Then she saw it. The study door. Open. The light flickering. But the room was empty. And just past it, the bedroom door. Shut. She knocked. No answer. She pushed it open. And the moment that followed would split her life into two halves. Before the scream, and after. The scene no one wants to describe. Police later described the room as disturbed. The bed linens were torn. The window cracked. The nightstand flipped. But it wasn't the mess that broke Romy. It was the stillness. Rob Reiner was found lying beside his wife, his eyes closed, as if sleeping. But the deep wound across his chest said otherwise. Michelle, beside him, was curled in the fetal position, her hands beneath her face like she was hiding from something. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, no blood trail beyond the room. It was surgical, clean, and silent. The killer had known them. That much was clear. First suspect, the son who couldn't outrun his past. Nick Reiner. He was the easy answer. The low-hanging fruit for the press. Troubled. In and out of rehab. Estranged. Living in the guest house barely 50 yards away. He'd once punched a hole in a studio wall after being cut out of a film pitch. He had debts. He had rage. When officers knocked on his guest house door, he didn't answer. They found him asleep. Or pretending to be. He denied everything. But there were inconsistencies. His phone had been powered off during a critical 2-hour window. A kitchen knife was missing. His prints were all over the main house. But of course they were. It was his home. Still, by 5:12 a.m., Nick was cuffed and driven away, staring blankly through the back window of a patrol car as flashing red lights bathed the gates of the estate. But something was off. Jake arrived an hour later. He was stunned, breathless, but focused. He hugged Romy, asked questions, took mental notes. And from the moment he crossed the threshold into the house, he knew the narrative didn't match the evidence. Why were there no security alerts? Why no barking dogs? Why were the surveillance hard drives wiped clean from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m.? Jake didn't wait for permission. He knew where the backup cloud was stored. His father had shown him after a break-in years ago. And there, buried in the time-stamped folders, was a single video clip that hadn't been deleted. Not from the front door. Not from the hallway. From the living room. The frame that froze time. Jake watched it once. Then again. Then a third time. At 3:14 a.m., Tracy entered the living room. Her movements were brisk, deliberate. She dragged 2 cardboard boxes to the fireplace. Opened one. Pulled out what looked like a leather portfolio. Jake's stomach dropped. He recognized it. It was Rob's personal journal. She didn't hesitate. She tore out the pages and fed them to the flames. Next came framed photographs. Handwritten notes. A letter with Jake's name on it. She never blinked. Never paused. And then, the final image, the one that made Jake's throat tighten. Tracy stood in front of the fire, holding a silver Zippo lighter. She stared into the camera for less than a second, then flicked the flame, and walked away. Romy's breakdown. When Jake showed her the footage, Romy collapsed to the floor. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would she do that?" Jake didn't answer. Because he didn't know either. But part of him did. Tracy wasn't acting like someone grieving. She was acting like someone erasing. And you only erase when something is too dangerous to be seen. The police begin to ask the wrong questions. LAPD detectives returned to the house later that day. They collected evidence. Interviewed neighbors. Reviewed security logs. But the narrative stayed the same. Nick was unstable. Nick was angry. Nick was close. And Tracy? She was quiet. Cooperative. Too cooperative. She told officers she had no knowledge of Rob's private files. She claimed she'd never used the fireplace. She said she was asleep at a friend's house in Laurel Canyon, an alibi that later collapsed when that friend denied it completely. Still no arrest. No questions. No urgency. Just a shrug. And Jake couldn't let that go. Closer than blood. For years, Jake had viewed Tracy as distant, complex, maybe even wounded, but never dangerous. Now he wasn't sure. He thought about the childhood fights, the lingering resentment, the way Tracy always accused Rob of favoring Jake. How she told Romy, once at Thanksgiving, "One day, you'll see that blood doesn't make you family. Control does." And now she was holding a lighter. over the remnants of Rob's identity. The world watches. By the end of the day, the story had broken. CNN, Hollywood legend Rob Reiner slain in double homicide. TMZ, tragic twist, son Nick arrested in Reiner family double murder. Variety, Reiner legacy in shock after brutal home crime. But no one mentioned Tracy. Not yet. Because no one had seen the video. Except Jake. And what he did next would put everything into motion. Because Jake didn't just leak the video. He sent it directly to the lead investigator. And 3 hours later, the case flipped upside down. Because the footage didn't just show a woman burning items. It showed the timeline collapsing. Tracy was in the house after Nick was already in custody. And what she was burning had Rob's blood on it. So who was Jake Reiner, really? Not the name you saw in the headlines. Not the son of Rob Reiner. Not the quiet figure standing behind police tape with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Jake Reiner was a man who had spent his adult life learning how to question narratives, how to dismantle official statements, how to read what wasn't being said. And now the narrative was about his own family, which raised a terrifying question. If a journalist is trained to doubt everything, what happens when the thing you're doubting is your blood? A life built on questions. Jake didn't grow up chasing fame. He grew up watching it from the sidelines. While Rob Reiner became a household name, Jake learned early that the spotlight had a cost. Cameras didn't just capture moments. They distorted them, simplified them, turned complex people into characters. So Jake chose a different path. Investigative journalism. Friends say it wasn't accidental. It was defensive. A way to stay grounded in truth when everything around him felt curated. Jake built a career on asking uncomfortable questions. Corruption, abuse of power, hidden financial trails. Stories that powerful people didn't want told. And now? Now the most dangerous story of his life was sitting in his inbox. Time-stamped. Backed up. Impossible to unsee. The footage of Tracy at the fireplace wasn't just suspicious. It was evidentiary. And Jake knew it. When instinct replaces grief, there's a moment after trauma when the brain chooses a path. Some people collapse. Some people dissociate. Some people go into action. Jake went into action, not because he didn't love his father, but because loving Rob meant protecting the truth, even if it destroyed what was left of the family. He opened a notebook. Not digital. Paper. First page. Timeline. 1:12 a.m. Estimated time of attack. 2:05 a.m. Nick's phone goes dark. 2:41 a.m. Nick detained. 3:14 a.m. Tracy burns items in living room. Jake circled the last line twice. Why would someone burn documents after a suspect had already been arrested? Unless they weren't trying to protect Nick. They were trying to protect themselves. The man behind the calm. Those who didn't know Jake assumed he was cold that week. They were wrong. He was terrified. Because calm wasn't the absence of emotion. It was containment. Inside, Jake was replaying every family dinner. Every awkward silence. Every moment Tracy seemed just a little too tense when Rob talked about estate planning or legacy. He remembered a conversation from 6 months earlier. Rob, half joking. You know, Jake, when I'm gone, this house will tell stories. Tracy, sharp laugh. Only if you leave anything worth telling. Everyone laughed. Everyone moved on. Except Jake. The first confrontation he didn't have. Jake wanted to confront Tracy immediately. He didn't. Why? Because journalists don't tip off their subjects. Especially not when those subjects might be destroying evidence. Instead, Jake watched. He observed how Tracy interacted with detectives. How she nodded at the right moments. How she volunteered just enough information to seem helpful, but never enough to be vulnerable. He noticed how she avoided eye contact when Rob's name came up. He noticed how she corrected Romy's version of events. Subtly, softly, but consistently. And he noticed something else. Tracy never asked about the investigation. Not once. Romy sees a different brother. Romy watched Jake transform. The brother who used to tease her about her playlist was now pacing the halls with a legal pad, replaying audio, making calls in hushed tones. At one point, she snapped. Are you even sad? She asked. Jake looked at her, stunned. What? You haven't cried, Romy said. You haven't screamed. You're acting like this is work. Jake swallowed hard. That's because if I let myself feel it, he said quietly, I won't be able to stop. And then no one will be watching the details. Romy didn't respond. But she understood. Because someone had to. The dangerous skill of pattern recognition. Jake's greatest strength had always been pattern recognition, and patterns were emerging. Nick's alleged motive was emotional. Rage. Addiction. Jealousy. But Tracy's behavior? Strategic. Calculated. Intentional. She wasn't spiraling. She was managing fallout. Jake compared it to cases he'd covered before. Corporate scandals. Political cover-ups. Same playbook. Control the narrative. Destroy primary sources. Create plausible distance. Let the obvious suspect take the fall. And the obvious suspect here was already in jail. The question no one wanted asked. Jake finally asked it out loud. What if Nick didn't do it? The room went silent. Romy stared at him like he'd just committed a crime himself. You think someone else? She whispered. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Who benefits from Nick being blamed? Romy's face drained of color. Because the answer wasn't complicated. If Nick went down, the investigation stopped. The family closed ranks. And certain questions never got asked. A journalist's curse. Jake hated himself for thinking like this. What kind of person suspects their own sister hours after their parents are murdered? But journalism had taught him something brutal. Truth doesn't care about comfort. And it certainly doesn't care about family dinners. Jake began doing what he always did. He verified. He cross-checked Tracy's statements with timestamps. He requested phone metadata through a source. He reviewed financial documents Rob had sent him months earlier, just in case. And buried inside one email chain, he found something chilling. A subject line from Rob, dated 3 weeks before his death. Tracy. Final decision. The body of the email was gone. Deleted. But the subject line remained. Final decision about what? The reluctant detective. Jake never wanted to be a detective. He didn't want to carry this responsibility. But responsibility had a way of choosing you. Every time he looked at Romy, shaking and sleepless, he knew he couldn't stop. Every time he thought of Nick sitting alone in a cell, he knew he couldn't stop. And every time he replayed the image of Tracy lighting that flame, he knew stopping wasn't an option. Because fires aren't lit by accident. They're lit to destroy something. Or someone. A new rule. Jake made a rule for himself. No assumptions. Only evidence. And the next piece of evidence was already waiting. Because while Tracy had burned what she thought were all of Rob's secrets, she missed one thing. A backup. Stored where she'd never think to look. And when Jake found it, it wouldn't just change how he saw Tracy. It would change how the police saw the entire case. And it would force Jake to cross a line he could never uncross. Because the truth was no longer just dangerous. It was explosive. What if the one person you trust most is hiding the darkest truth of all? That was the question Romy Reiner hadn't dared to ask herself. Not until the night she opened her old writing desk. Not until the night she turned the key to a drawer she hadn't unlocked in over a year. Not until she found the journal. The one with the black leather cover and the cracked spine, buried beneath old scripts and Polaroids. A diary she had started writing not to document her life, but to survive it. Because Romy hadn't just been mourning her parents. She'd been afraid. And for months before the murders, she had been quietly tracking one terrifying pattern. A pattern named Tracy. The first entry that changed everything. Jake found the diary by accident. It was 2 days after Rob and Michelle's deaths. Romy had barely slept. Her eyes were raw, her voice hoarse. Jake was going through family files in Romy's home office when he knocked over a box labeled college notes. Outspilled books, old receipts, ticket stubs, and then the diary. He went to hand it back. But Romy flinched. She stared at the cover like it was radioactive. Jake raised an eyebrow. What is it? Her voice was barely a whisper. Something I never wanted anyone to read. Jake paused. But maybe. Something someone needs to read. Romy nodded. And opened the book. November 2nd. She was watching me again. The entry was short. Just a few lines. Tracy stared at me again today at brunch. Not like a sister. Like I was a stranger. She didn't say much, just kept drinking and chewing ice. When Dad brought up the foundation meeting, she squeezed her fork so hard I thought it would snap. Jake looked up. Was this common? Romy hesitated. It got worse after Dad told her he was cutting off her project funding. Jake blinked. He was cutting her off? Romy nodded. She kept pushing this film she wanted to direct. A vanity thing. Dad said no. Said it was time for her to stand on her own. She didn't take it well. December 1st. I heard her in Dad's office. Another entry. 1:14 a.m. I couldn't sleep. Heard footsteps. Peeked down the hall. Tracy was in Dad's office again. Third time this week. She didn't see me. She was reading his papers and muttering something. I only caught one word. Revenge. Jake swallowed hard. This wasn't paranoia. This was documentation. And it painted a picture far more sinister than anyone had considered. Tracy wasn't just angry. She was obsessed. An obsession in the Reiner family had consequences. The phone call that vanished. Jake turned the page. A long entry, dated December 8th. Dad called me this morning. Said he was nervous about something. Said he needed to tell me something soon, in case anything happens. But then he changed the subject. I asked him what he meant, and he just laughed it off. Now I can't stop thinking about it. What did he mean? Jake looked at Romy. Did he ever bring it up again? No, she said quietly. That was the last time I spoke to him. Jake exhaled. So Rob knew something was wrong. He was trying to warn her, but he never got the chance. The diary as a map. Jake scanned the remaining entries, and a pattern emerged. Each one had dates, details, locations, tone shifts, but most important, each one showed Tracy becoming less like a grieving daughter and more like a ticking clock. She was always watching, always listening, always present in the house at odd hours. And Romy, to her credit, had noticed it all. She had written her fears into paper because she was too afraid to speak them aloud. I thought I was just being dramatic, she said. Like maybe I was projecting. Jake shook his head. You were surviving. December 10th, I found the letter. I shouldn't have. This was the final entry before the murders. Romy had found a letter in Rob's jacket pocket. Handwritten, torn at the edges. No envelope. It wasn't addressed to her. Or to Jake. Or to Tracy. It was addressed to R. But not Romy. This R was older. Formal. Resentful. I don't owe you anything, it read. But I'm offering peace. I've changed the terms. The house stays in the family, but the power doesn't. I'm sorry if this feels cruel. But legacies can't be held hostage. Romy had taken a photo of the letter. Jake studied it, then froze. Because Rob's signature wasn't at the bottom. It was missing. The letter's meaning. What do you think he meant by the power doesn't? Romy asked. Jake hesitated. I think he meant control. Over the estate. Over the narrative. Over him. Romy blinked. So, Tracy lost everything. Jake nodded slowly. And she knew it. That's why she was in the office at night. That's why she went silent. That's why she started burning things. Romy's hands were trembling. She knew he was cutting her out. The warning that came too late. There was one more thing. Tucked into the back flap of the diary was a scrap of lined notebook paper. It wasn't in Romy's handwriting. It was jagged, angry, and it read, You don't belong here. Neither do your lies. Watch yourself. No signature. No date. Just one line of ink, etched so hard into the page it had bled through. Romy never told anyone about it. Until now. Jake compared the handwriting to some of Tracy's notes in old emails, and it matched perfectly what the diary meant. This wasn't just a journal. It was a log, a silent record of tension, fear, and escalating hostility. And when Jake compiled the entries with his own notes, a brutal truth emerged. Tracy wasn't spiraling after the murder. She was spiraling before it. And Rob? He wasn't just a victim. He may have known she was capable of something unthinkable, and he tried to stop her. He just didn't move fast enough. The final entry. There was one entry left, scribbled hastily, dated the morning after the murders. Romy had written it through tears, barely legible. I saw her. Tracy. She was in the hall before I called 911. She said, Don't go in there. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She just stared, and then she walked into the study and locked the door. I should have followed her. I should have stopped her, but I was too scared. And now, she hadn't finished the sentence. Jake closed the diary slowly, then looked at Romy. Romy, this changes everything. The dangerous decision. What Jake held in his hands wasn't admissible in court, but it was a roadmap, a blueprint of Tracy's descent, a direct link between motive and the aftermath. But even more importantly, it raised a terrifying possibility. What if Tracy didn't just destroy evidence? What if she was the one who planned it all? And if so, did she do it alone? Because someone had disabled the cameras, someone had wiped the files, and someone had given Nick just enough rope to hang himself. Next steps. Jake made a copy of the diary, scanned every page, filed the originals in a locked drawer. Then he made a call, not to the police, to a contact, a former FBI profiler. Because now, Jake wasn't just building a theory. He was building a case. And the next step would force him to do the one thing he swore he never would. He'd have to interrogate his own past. Because Tracy's spiral didn't start this year. It started years ago. And when Jake uncovered the next piece, he'd realize she wasn't acting alone. And the truth was far, far darker than anyone imagined. What if the person they all blamed was the one being set up the entire time? Nick Reiner had spent most of his life living under the shadow of his last name and then trying to escape it. Drugs, rehab, reconciliation, relapse. His story had become a cautionary tale. Tabloid headlines, rehab blogs, anonymous Hollywood whispers. By the time his parents were found dead in their bedroom, Nick's name had already been synonymous with trouble. So when the police found him sleeping in the guest house, alone and phoneless, he became the obvious choice. But obvious doesn't mean guilty. And Jake Reiner was about to uncover a trail of contradictions that made one thing chillingly clear. Nick may have been a mess, but he wasn't a murderer. The easy target. Jake had known it was coming. The moment the story broke, the media zeroed in on one thing: Nick's past. His 2016 overdose. The public spat with Rob over a failed screenplay. His 30-day disappearance after a rehab relapse in 2020. He was flawed, publicly flawed. And in stories like this, the world likes easy villains. But what Jake saw in the police timeline didn't add up. Nick was arrested at 2:41 a.m. Rob and Michelle were believed to have died between 1:10 and 1:20 a.m. The guest house, Nick's space, was locked from the inside. No blood, no weapon, no defensive wounds. And one more thing, Nick was already under sedation. The forgotten prescription. Jake remembered something Romy mentioned offhand. Nick took his meds before bed, knocked out for hours. Jake asked what they were. Seroquel, she said. He started using it after the last panic episode. Jake's eyes widened. Seroquel wasn't a light sedative. At the dosage Nick had been prescribed, it would take a grown man down hard within 30 minutes. Sleep heavy, difficult to wake, which meant, if he took them at midnight, as he claimed, he would have been borderline comatose by 1 a.m. Too out of it to stab anyone, let alone two people. Jake needed proof, so he checked Nick's pill bottle in the guest house. It had been filled exactly 6 days earlier. 30 pills dispensed, 23 remained. So why was he arrested? Because of one chilling detail. A kitchen knife was missing from the main house. Nick's fingerprints were found on the drawer, open and shut. Not quite. Those prints weren't fresh. They were smudged, faded. A forensics expert later told Jake they were likely days old. And then came the security question. How did Nick get into the main house with the alarm armed? He couldn't have, unless someone else disarmed it. And guess who had the code? Tracy. A timeline with too many holes. Jake rebuilt the sequence again. 12:15 a.m., Nick takes his meds. 12:45 a.m., alarm set by Rob, as per smart home log. 1:12 a.m., estimated time of murder. 2:41 a.m., Nick arrested. 3:14 a.m. Tracy seen burning documents. So unless Nick murdered his parents in a sedative stupor, reset the alarm, erased the cameras, and went back to sleep, none of it made sense. Especially since the only person seen in the house after the murder was Tracy. Tracy's story keeps shifting. When detectives first questioned Tracy, she claimed she had been at a friend's house all night. That friend later denied it. Tracy then changed her story. She said she was asleep in her car near the house, claiming she had returned from a late drive, but didn't want to disturb anyone. But camera logs showed otherwise. A vehicle matching Tracy's car was caught pulling into the driveway at 1:29 a.m., exactly 17 minutes after the estimated time of death. And she wasn't sleeping. She was holding bags. Jake confirmed it with footage. She walked straight into the house, with gloves on. Nick's first statement from jail. 3 days after the murder, Jake was granted visitation. Nick looked hollowed out, unshaven, eyes bloodshot. But his first words to Jake were searing. I didn't kill them, man. I couldn't have. I don't even remember falling asleep. Jake nodded. I believe you. Nick blinked. No one else does. Jake leaned in. They will. Nick's eyes flickered with something new. Hope. The confession that wasn't. The official police report listed Nick as cooperative but confused. He admitted to being angry at Rob, admitted he'd screamed at him days before. But anger isn't guilt. And when asked about the weapon, Nick shrugged. There are like 15 knives in that kitchen. I've cooked there before. Probably touched half of them. Honest, but easy to twist. Jake knew this was enough to keep Nick under suspicion, especially with the family still reeling. But what if someone wanted him to be the fall guy? What if someone with access was counting on Nick's past to do the dirty work for them? The forgotten call. Then came a breakthrough. Jake checked Rob's call logs. At 12:53 a.m., less than 20 minutes before the estimated time of death, Rob received a call from a blocked number. Duration, 1 minute, 22 seconds. No voicemail. No follow-up. Just gone. But Romy remembered something. That night, I heard Dad's voice, she said. I couldn't make out what he said, but he sounded agitated. Jake cross-checked smart home audio logs. The system was tied to voice commands. At 12:56 a.m., Rob's voice activated the living room assistant. He said, "Call canceled." Then silence. He had taken a call, then hung up. Why? And who was he speaking to? The voicemail. Jake remembered the burner phone he found in the safe. The one Rob had labeled private. He charged it and found one voicemail. From Nick. Left 2 days before the murder. Hey Dad, I'm sorry. I'm trying. I hate that I keep screwing up. I miss you. I hope we can talk soon. I'll be at the guest house all week. I'm not going anywhere. I swear. I love you. Jake stared at the screen for a long time. This wasn't a killer. This was a son begging for connection. And someone else had silenced that plea, for good. But why frame him? Jake thought about the motive. What did Tracy gain by framing Nick? Simple. He was already fragile, already doubted, already rejected. If he went down, no one would question the details. Tracy would gain access to the estate again, especially with Rob and Michelle gone. And the one person standing in her way was sleeping under heavy sedation. But Tracy had miscalculated, because Jake was awake, and he had started asking questions. The ticking clock. Nick's arraignment was scheduled for the following week. If Jake didn't uncover proof soon, Nick would be formally charged with double homicide. And once the DA locked in, there would be no room for nuance. Jake reviewed everything again. The surveillance, the audio, the call logs. And then he found it. A 3-second clip, buried inside the smart home system. A voice. Low. Angry. Female. Do it. Now. Or you'll lose everything. The timestamp? 12:54 a.m. Just seconds after Rob's mysterious call. The voice? It wasn't Romy's. And it sure as hell wasn't Michelle's. Jake ran it through a voice match. Preliminary result? 98% match with Tracy Reiner. The final thread. Jake walked into the Brentwood police station the next day with a flash drive in hand. He didn't accuse. He didn't speculate. He showed them. Timeline inconsistencies. Voice samples. Medication logs. Security footage. And the final sentence? Delivered with the same calm, focused precision Jake was known for on camera. You're arresting the wrong sibling. But would they listen? The detectives stared at the files. Silent. Tense. And then one of them finally said, "Where's the original audio?" Jake nodded. He had it. But he didn't give it to them yet. Because he knew how this worked. Evidence could vanish. Truth could drown. He needed leverage. He needed Romy to speak up. Because without her, this would all be theory. And Tracy? She was already slipping away. What if the truth you needed to prove your innocence was hidden in plain sight, burning right in front of you? Jake Reiner had been up for 19 hours straight. No food, no shower. Just coffee, adrenaline, and one relentless obsession, proving that his half-sister Tracy Reiner wasn't just grieving her father's murder. She was covering something up, something massive, and maybe committing it herself. But to do that, he needed the one piece of evidence no one else had touched. No one else had noticed. No one else had the clearance to access. The surveillance footage Rob himself had installed. It was the house's silent witness. A set of unassuming black domes tucked into the corners of ceilings. More than just cameras, they were part of a private cloud system, separate from the smart home logs the police had seized. Why? Because Rob didn't trust anyone. Not the LAPD, and not even his own family. The hidden vault of memory. Rob's system wasn't labeled. No camera files folder. No big blinking icon. Instead, It was disguised inside an encrypted photo album app labeled Location Scouting 2006. Classic Rob. Playful. Paranoid. Brilliant. Jake found it while combing through his father's old laptop, using a password Romy had remembered from an old family joke. Meathead 123. A nod to Rob's iconic role on All in the Family. Inside. Folders. Dozens. Each labeled by date. Time-stamped to the second. Jake's hands shook as he clicked open December 14th. The night it all happened. 3:13 a.m. The room that should have been empty. The fireplace. The marble-tiled living room. The heart of the house. 3:13 a.m. The moment it all began. Tracy appears. Hair tied back. Hoodie zipped. Gloves on. She's carrying something heavy. 2 boxes. Cardboard. Battered, but sealed. She drops one with a thud, then kneels at the hearth. What happens next chills Jake to his core. She opens the box. Pulls out folders. Handwritten notes. Film scripts. Family letters. And begins tossing them, one by one, into the fire. Not quickly. Not impulsively. Deliberately. Like someone removing obstacles. Like someone preparing the world for a version of events where certain truths no longer exist. 3:16 a.m. The burned legacy. Jake zooms in. One paper Tracy tosses into the flames has his name on it. Not typed. Handwritten. He freezes the frame. It's a note. A personal one. He wrote it to his father 4 years ago after a fight. He'd apologized. Said he regretted cutting off contact. It was private. Something Rob had kept in a folder labeled Letters from Jake. And now it was turning to ash. Then comes a flash of silver. A framed photo. Jake and Rob, arm in arm at the premiere of The Bucket List. Tracy doesn't even flinch as she smashes the glass against the edge of the hearth, then feeds the pieces into the fire. Jake feels sick. This wasn't grief. This was erasure. 3:19 a.m. The folder labeled R. She opens the second box. Jake squints. The top file says R in red marker. She hesitates. Just for a second. Then throws it in, too. It catches fast, almost too fast. Then she backs away. Watches it all burn. Not a tear. Not a blink. Just cold satisfaction. Like a surgeon cauterizing a wound. Or a criminal watching the evidence disappear. Romy joins the watch. Jake calls Romy into the study. She sits beside him, legs folded, silent. When she sees Tracy on screen, her hands go to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispers. "That's the box I saw in the hallway." Jake looks at her sharply. "You saw it?" Romy nods. "I thought she was just moving her stuff out." Jake doesn't blink. She wasn't. 3:24 a.m. The final item. Just when Jake thinks it's over, Tracy pulls out one last thing. A notebook. Leather-bound. Thick. Familiar. Romy gasps. "Is that?" Jake knows instantly. It's Rob's personal journal. The one he used to write in every morning. Tracy doesn't hesitate. She tears out the first few pages. Reads one. Her lips move. Jake boosts the audio, filters background noise, applies speech enhancement. And then, he hears her say, "No one needs to see this." Then she shreds the pages, tosses them in, and slams the metal gate shut on the fireplace. 3:26 a.m. She looks at the camera. Jake leans in. The camera's view is angled, meant to be hidden. But Tracy pauses and looks directly into it. Just for a split second. Not with fear. With awareness. As if to say, "I know you're watching." And then she walks away. The forgotten security feed. Jake doesn't stop there. He opens the second feed. The one from the hallway camera outside Rob's study. Time, 1:31 a.m. Tracy entering. With gloves. Time, 1:48 a.m. Tracy leaving. No gloves. Holding something tightly wrapped in a gray hoodie. Time, 1:50 a.m. The study light goes off. And then darkness. She'd taken something from Rob's private space before the fire. And now Jake was sure. The destruction was calculated. And he had it all on tape. The drive to the station. Jake didn't wait. He grabbed the drive, packed it in an evidence bag, and called Romy. "You need to come with me." Romy hesitated. "Are you sure?" Jake nodded. "This is it." She got in the car. No words were exchanged. Just tension, rage, heartbreak. Because they weren't just turning over a tape. They were turning over their sister. But not everyone wanted to see. At the station, Jake played the footage for the lead detective. The officer watched it all. The boxes. The fire. The journal. He leaned back. That's compelling, he said. But then came the word Jake hated. Circumstantial. Jake stood. Are you serious? The detective held up his hands. Look, I believe something's off. But burning papers doesn't prove murder. Jake gritted his teeth. It proves cover-up. You have to reopen the timeline. The detective nodded slowly. We will. But Jake had heard that tone before. The tone that meant, we'll wait until the media cools down. Jake couldn't wait. A choice between family and truth. That night, Jake sat with Romy on the back patio of the house. The fire pit flickered gently between them. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Finally, Romy asked, what do we do now? Jake looked at her. The only thing we can do. Expose her. Jake nodded. Expose the truth. But what if she didn't act alone? Jake's eyes narrowed. I don't think she did. Romy went pale. You mean Nick? Jake shook his head. No. I mean someone else. Who? Jake paused, then looked toward the house. At the office where Rob had kept his most guarded files. At the safe that had once held the burner phone. At the floorboards that creaked in only one specific hallway. And then he said, there's something in the study we missed. What if the most incriminating evidence wasn't hidden, but half-burned, waiting to be found by the only person still paying attention? Jake Reiner knew one thing. Tracy had moved too fast. That fire she started in the early hours of the morning wasn't just about grief or fury. It was surgical, controlled, targeted. But fire is never perfect. It flickers. It fails. It leaves behind traces. And Jake, trained to find what others overlook, believed not everything had turned to ash. Something had survived. Maybe even something Rob had wanted someone to find. And that someone was Jake. Back to the scene of the erasure. 2 days later, Jake returned to the estate, not as a son, but as an investigator. The police had cleared the main house. Technically, it was still part of a crime scene, but without fresh evidence or arrests, the family had been allowed access again, which meant Tracy could return too, and Jake had to move before she did. Romy was already waiting in the living room. The fireplace, now cold and silent, still smelled faintly of smoke and scorched paper. The same space where a daughter had fed her father's legacy to the flames now sat like a crime scene dressed in marble. Jake knelt down and slipped on gloves. Romy asked quietly, what are we looking for? Jake didn't look up. Anything that refused to burn. The ashes speak. They worked slowly, sifting through charred fragments, blackened curls of paper, the twisted remnants of photo frames. Jake gently lifted a corner of the fireplace grate, and that's when he saw it. Wedged between the inner wall and the back edge of the hearth was a scrap of thick, high-grade paper. It hadn't fully ignited. The edges were browned, but the center was still legible. He used tweezers to extract it and carefully laid it flat on the floor. Romy knelt beside him, squinting. It was a torn page. From a journal. Rob's handwriting. Jake read aloud. I never wanted to choose between them, but she's made it impossible. I fear what she's capable of, and I can't let her have control. Not again. Not ever. Romy gasped. Jake whispered. He wasn't talking about Nick. She nodded slowly. He meant Tracy. The red file. Jake reached deeper into the ashes. A thin layer of soot gave way to something jagged and metallic. He pulled it free. Half a scorched file clip, still attached to the remains of a folder. The label was barely visible, but Jake could make out the first letter. R. The same red R they'd seen on the surveillance footage. Inside were more singed pages, some completely destroyed, but one had a partial letterhead. Reiner Family Trust, addendum proposal. The date? 2 weeks before the murder. The document had been folded, protected in the folder. Only the corners were burned, the middle still readable. Jake scanned the opening lines. This revised clause permanently revokes any inheritance stake held by Tracy Reiner in the event of misconduct or criminal activity determined by family vote or legal court. Jake sat back. Oh my God. Romy covered her mouth. Rob had been updating the estate, and Tracy had known. The why becomes clear. Jake whispered. He was going to cut her out permanently. Romy's voice shook. And if she found that, she'd have nothing left. Jake finished. It wasn't just a financial betrayal. It was a symbolic one. Tracy had always felt second tier. Adopted. Sidelined. Treated like a satellite to Jake's and Romy's stars. This document made it official. Rob had put it in writing. And for someone like Tracy, that was war. A shocking discovery in the grate. Jake moved one last log, charred almost to nothing. Beneath it, a flash of gold. He reached in and pulled out a scorched, bent metal object. Romy inhaled sharply. It was a wedding band. Rob's. The engraving was still visible on the inner side. M+R always. Jake whispered. Why the hell would that be in here? Romy's eyes widened. He never took it off. Jake stood slowly. Unless someone took it off him. They stared at each other. This wasn't a symbolic burn anymore. This was personal desecration. Matching the timeline. Jake reviewed the footage again. At 3:26 a.m., Tracy had tossed a small object into the fire, curled inside a tissue. Now he knew what it was. Rob's wedding band. It hadn't burned fully, metal doesn't. But its presence spoke volumes. She wasn't just destroying files. She was erasing bonds. Rewriting history. Making sure Michelle wouldn't wear the ring into her casket because it had already been incinerated. That wasn't mourning. That was rage. A plan to confront. Jake took photos of everything. The journal page. The trust document fragment. The wedding band. Each one a nail in the coffin of the story Tracy had tried to spin. But evidence only matters if it lands. Jake and Romy made a decision. They would confront her. Not with yelling. Not with threats. With truth. And cameras rolling. They wanted her response documented. Because if she crumbled, if her guilt showed, they'd have the final piece. And if she didn't, they'd keep digging. The meeting is set. They invited her to the house. Neutral ground. Jake told her, we just want to talk. Clear the air. Tracy agreed. Said she wanted to heal the family. Said she'd bring coffee. Jake placed a phone in his jacket. Recording. Romy had another in her purse. Both hidden. They sat by the fireplace. Romy lit a small candle, the scent of cedar drifting through the air. Tracy arrived right on time, wearing black, and smiling. The confrontation. Jake began gently. We've been reviewing some old papers. Tracy's smile didn't falter. Of course. So much to process. Romy asked, do you remember the red file? Tracy blinked. What file? Jake pulled out the scorched remains. Her face twitched. Barely, but it twitched. Romy laid the journal page on the table. Tracy's eyes scanned it. Then she exhaled. Long, slow. I didn't want to hurt anyone, she said. Jake leaned forward. Then why burn Dad's ring? Tracy looked down, then said something that sent shivers down both their spines. Because he didn't deserve to wear it anymore. The cracking mask. Jake froze. You're saying he deserved this? Tracy's voice hardened. He abandoned me. He chose you. Both of you. And now you're sitting in his chair like you own it. Romy whispered. Tracy, what did you do? Tracy's eyes turned sharp. I cleaned up the mess. Jake sat back. That was it. She wasn't confessing to murder. But she'd admitted destruction, deception, motivation, and she hadn't denied anything. The phone recordings sent. That night, Jake sent the audio to the detective. And this time, they didn't say circumstantial. They said, come in. Because with the footage, the journal, the trust clause, the ring, and now the recording, they had a pattern. And patterns tell stories, even when the characters lie. But one detail still haunted Jake. Tracy had said something strange. I cleaned up the mess. That wasn't just metaphorical. It was literal. And it suggested something darker. That she hadn't acted alone. That someone else had committed the crime. And Tracy had simply taken care of what was left. But who? And why? Because Rob's enemies weren't limited to inside the house. And the burner phone in his safe had one more contact number Jake hadn't tried yet. And when he finally did, a voice answered. One that would shake this case wide open. What if the dead could speak, and what they left behind could expose the living? It was after midnight when Jake Reiner made the call. He sat alone in his father's study, the desk lamp casting long shadows across scattered files and burned fragments. The estate was quiet now. Romy had gone to bed. Tracy hadn't been seen since the confrontation. But one thing lingered in Jake's mind, louder than ever. I cleaned up the mess. That was Tracy's admission. But what was the mess? Who had made it? And was there something, some clue, some letter, some voice Rob had left behind to explain what he knew? Jake unlocked the burner phone again. One last contact stood untouched. Labeled, Ruth. A voice from the past. Jake hesitated, then pressed call. The phone rang once. Twice. Then picked up. A raspy female voice answered. Hello. Jake cleared his throat. Is this Ruth? A long pause. Who's calling? My name is Jake. Jake Reiner. Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. You're his son. Yes. Another pause. Then, I thought this call would come sooner. Who was Ruth? Her name had appeared before, on the half-burnt letter Romy had found in Rob's coat pocket. Tawar. At the time, Jake had assumed it was Romy. But now he realized it was Ruth. The voice on the phone was